When an arrogant waiter refused to serve an elderly black woman, the entire restaurant turned a blind eye. But then, a luxury car pulled up outside, and the man who stepped out would make him regret every word he had just said. The restaurant was the kind of place where exclusivity was a virtue. Nestled in the heart of the city, its polished marble floors, dim chandeliers, and hushed conversations set the tone for an atmosphere reserved for the wealthy and the elite. The kind of place where names mattered, where status dictated respect. Amid the carefully curated clientele, an elderly black woman stepped inside. She was dressed modestly, an elegant but simple beige dress, a pearl necklace resting gently against her collarbone. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back neatly, and she carried herself with quiet dignity. She didn't belong to the typical crowd that frequented the restaurant, and that was exactly why people noticed her the moment she entered. She walked slowly, her frail hands resting lightly on the edge of a chair as she settled into a table by the window. The golden sunlight bathed her face in a warm glow, but the cold stares around her were unmistakable. Conversations dipped, eyes flicked in her direction before quickly turning away. A young waiter, no older than 25, strode towards her table. He had sharp features, a neatly pressed uniform, and the air of someone who believed himself superior to those he deemed unworthy. The smirk tugging at the corners of his lips spoke volumes before he even opened his mouth. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice laced with polite hostility. "This restaurant has a policy. We reserve the right to decline service. I'm afraid you'll have to leave." The elderly woman blinked up at him, unfazed. "I just want a cup of tea." His smirk widened. "Like I said, we don't serve people like you here." A hush fell over the surrounding tables. Some guests glanced over, a flicker of discomfort in their expressions. But no one spoke up. No one defended her. They all simply watched, waiting to see what she would do. But she didn't fight back. She didn't raise her voice or demand to see the manager. Instead, she simply exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening briefly around the edge of the table before relaxing again. Her face remained composed, though the weight of exhaustion, of years spent enduring moments like these, was evident in her eyes. She adjusted her posture, sitting a little straighter. "I see," she murmured, almost to herself. The waiter rolled his eyes and turned on his heel, expecting her to leave. But she didn't. She remained seated, her presence a quiet defiance against the injustice of the moment. Then, the doors of the restaurant swung open. A luxury black sedan pulled up outside, its glossy surface reflecting the afternoon sun. The sound of polished dress shoes striking the marble floor echoed through the space. The man who entered commanded attention instantly. He was tall, sharply dressed in a tailored navy suit, his posture straight, his presence exuding authority. His chiseled features and piercing gaze carried the kind of power that made people straighten in their seats, adjust their ties, and lower their voices. It was only when he removed his sunglasses and locked eyes with the elderly woman that everything changed. He walked towards her, slow but purposeful, ignoring the stunned silence that had overtaken the restaurant. And then, with the gentlest of gestures, he reached down and took her hand. "Mother," he said softly, "did someone give you trouble?" And just like that, the young waiter, who had been so smug, so dismissive just moments ago, felt the blood drain from his face. His confidence crumbled as realization set in. The woman he had refused to serve was the mother of Jonathan Carter, one of the most powerful men in the city, a man whose name alone could bring careers to an abrupt halt. And Jonathan Carter was looking directly at him. The room was suffocatingly silent. Every set of eyes in the restaurant was now locked on the man standing beside the elderly woman. The once smirking waiter stood motionless, his fingers gripping the notepad in his hand, so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had unknowingly humiliated the mother of one of the most powerful men in the city, Jonathan Carter, the name that made corporate executives tread carefully and legal adversaries sweat in their seats. Jonathan Carter wasn't just a high-profile attorney. He was the kind of man who could dismantle reputations with a single phone call, whose presence in a courtroom was enough to turn the tide of a case. And now, here he was, standing protectively beside his mother, his sharp gaze locked onto the trembling waiter. The waiter's lips parted as if to stammer out an excuse, but Jonathan's voice cut through the air first. Low, controlled, but razor-sharp. "What exactly did you say to my mother?" The young man swallowed hard. I didn't realize." Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Didn't realize what?" The silence stretched painfully. The restaurant's manager, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, suddenly rushed forward, sensing the disaster unfolding in front of him. His face was tight with forced politeness, his voice desperate to smooth over the situation. "Mr. Carter, I assure you this is a misunderstanding," the manager said quickly. "If your mother would like to be seated properly, we'd be honored to serve her. In fact, today's meal is on the house." Jonathan let out a slow exhale, the corners of his lips curling into a smile that wasn't remotely friendly. He turned to his mother. "Did you hear that, Mom?" he asked softly. "Now they're honored to serve you." His mother merely sighed, giving the manager a patient, knowing look. She had lived too many years to be surprised by moments like these. Her expression wasn't angry, just tired. Jonathan's gaze flicked back to the waiter. The young man was still standing there, looking as if he wished the ground would swallow him whole. "Let me guess," Jonathan said. "You took one look at my mother, decided she wasn't the right kind of customer for this place, and thought you could turn her away without consequence." The waiter's breath hitched. I didn't mean..." Jonathan took a step forward, his presence suffocatingly intense. "You didn't mean to get caught," he corrected. A couple seated at a nearby table quickly looked away, suddenly fascinated with their silverware. Others shifted uncomfortably, pretending they weren't watching, even as their ears strained to catch every word. The manager wiped his brow. "Mr. Carter, please, let's not make this into a bigger deal than it is." Jonathan let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Not a big deal? A waiter openly refuses to serve a black woman, my mother, in the middle of your restaurant, and that's not a big deal?" The manager blanched, realizing his mistake too late. Jonathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The weight of his words pressed down on the room like a lead blanket. "My mother has more grace in her little finger than most people in this room will ever have," he said, his tone measured but lethal. And yet, she was treated like she didn't belong, like she wasn't worthy of sitting at one of these tables. The waiter's entire body trembled now. He tried to meet Jonathan's gaze but failed, his eyes darting toward the exit as if considering an escape. Jonathan inhaled deeply, as if reining in something far more dangerous than anger. Then, he turned back to his mother, his expression softening instantly. "Mom," he said gently, "do you still want that tea?" His mother, ever composed, gave him a small smile. "Yes," she said simply. Jonathan nodded. Then, without looking at the waiter, he pulled out a chair for her. "Then we'll be staying." And just like that, the young waiter realized this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The weight of Jonathan's words hung thick in the air, pressing down on the waiter like an unbearable force. His legs felt weak, his hands clammy. Moments ago, he had been so sure of himself, so smug, so untouchable. And now, standing beneath the gaze of one of the most powerful men in the city, he felt like a child caught in a terrible mistake. The restaurant manager, still desperate to salvage the situation, forced a strained smile. "Of course, Mr. Carter. We will prepare the finest tea for your mother immediately. I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding." Jonathan didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge the manager's attempt to smooth things over. Instead, he turned to his mother, pulling out the chair for her, as if nothing had happened. "Please, Mom," he said softly. "Sit. You deserve to be comfortable." His mother lowered herself into the chair with grace, though there was a weariness in her eyes that only Jonathan could see. She had been through this too many times before. The insults, the exclusions, the dismissive stares, they had followed her all her life, like shadows clinging to the soles of her feet. But she had never let them define her. The other guests were watching now, pretending not to, but failing miserably. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others whispered behind their hands. The social elite didn't like confrontation, not when it reminded them of the ugly truths they preferred to ignore. The waiter, still rooted in place, finally found his voice. "Sir, I didn't mean any harm," he stammered. "I was just following." "Following what?" Jonathan's voice was quiet, but it cut through the waiter's excuse like a blade. "Your own prejudice? Some unwritten rule that tells you who is and isn't worthy of being treated with respect?" The waiter's face turned a deep shade of red. He glanced toward the manager, silently begging for a way out, but there was none. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his hands on the table as he looked the young man in the eye. "Tell me something," he said. "Would you have spoken to my mother that way if she walked in wearing diamonds and fur? If she arrived in a chauffeured car, draped in wealth for everyone to see?" The waiter swallowed hard. He had no answer. Jonathan nodded, as if he already knew. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he mused. "You don't see value in people unless it's wrapped in something you recognize, unless it's wearing the right suit, the right jewelry, the right skin." Silence. The kind that made every second stretch unbearably long. The manager cleared his throat, stepping in once again. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, this is not how we operate. This young man will be reprimanded immediately." Jonathan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, I have no doubt he will be. But not because you care about what happened, only because you're afraid of what I might do about it." The manager stiffened. The words were true, and everyone knew it. At that moment, the tea arrived. A different waiter, visibly nervous, carefully set the delicate porcelain cup in front of Jonathan's mother. She picked it up with a steady hand, taking a small sip before setting it back down with a satisfied nod. Jonathan watched her, his anger tempered by admiration. No matter how many times the world tried to push her down, she remained unshaken. He turned back to the waiter, who was now visibly trembling. "I hope you learn from this," Jonathan said, his voice even, "because next time, you may not be lucky enough to make your mistake in front of someone as patient as my mother." The young man nodded quickly, unable to meet his gaze, and with that, Jonathan turned his attention fully back to his mother, as if the waiter no longer existed. Because in that moment, he didn't. The waiter stood frozen, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. His entire world had shifted in the span of minutes. He had walked into work that morning confident, oblivious to the consequences of his own biases. believing that power belonged only to those he recognized as deserving of it. But now, standing under the unyielding gaze of Jonathan Carter, he felt powerless in a way he had never experienced before. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his demeanor relaxed, but his presence still suffocating. The manager lingered a few feet away, wringing his hands, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment unfold. The entire restaurant had become an unwilling audience to a lesson they would not soon forget. Jonathan's mother took another slow sip of her tea, her movements deliberate and unbothered, as if she were merely enjoying an afternoon out. The contrast between her quiet dignity and the waiter's visible distress was striking. Finally, Jonathan spoke again, his voice deceptively calm. "Do you understand what happened here today?" The waiter flinched at the directness of the question. He opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling to find the right words. I made a mistake," he stammered. Jonathan arched an eyebrow. "A mistake?" He tilted his head slightly. "A mistake is when you trip over a curb. A mistake is when you forget someone's drink order. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice." The waiter swallowed hard, his throat dry. He knew there was no way to argue against it. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood of the table. "Let me tell you something about my mother." His voice was softer now, but the weight behind it remained. She was born into a world that told her she was less than, a world that refused to see her worth unless it was convenient. And yet, she survived. She thrived. Without money, without status, without people like you deciding whether she was worthy of being treated with respect. His mother remained silent, letting her son speak for her. She had fought her battles long before this day, and she had nothing to prove to anyone in that room. Jonathan's eyes locked onto the waiter's. "What you did today, it's not new. It's not unique. People like my mother have spent their whole lives navigating a world designed to push them aside. And you," he gestured towards the trembling man in front of him, "you thought you could be another obstacle in her way." The waiter's breath hitched, shame creeping up his spine. "But here's the thing," Jonathan continued, his voice steady. "You are nothing more than a footnote in her story, a moment she will forget long before you do. Because while you will replay this day over and over, wondering how you let your ignorance expose you, my mother," he turned to her with a warm smile, "she will simply move forward, the way she always has." His mother gave a small, knowing nod. "It's always been like this," she said softly, her voice laced with wisdom rather than resentment. "People reveal themselves, one way or another." Jonathan turned back to the manager, his expression unreadable. "You want to make this right?" He gestured toward his mother's teacup. "Start by ensuring that the next time a woman like my mother walks in here, she is treated with the same respect as the wealthiest man in the room." The manager nodded rapidly. "Of course, Mr. Carter. I promise. This will never happen again." Jonathan smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Oh, I know it won't." The implication was clear. This was not a request. It was a demand. And no one in that room doubted that if another injustice occurred within these walls, Jonathan Carter would ensure this restaurant never saw another customer again. With that, he turned back to his mother. "Are you ready to go, Mom?" She placed her teacup down gently, her fingers resting for a moment against the fine porcelain. Then, with the same quiet grace that had carried her through a lifetime of moments like these, she nodded. "Yes, Jonathan, I'm ready." And as they stood, the entire restaurant remained silent, watching them walk toward the door, their presence lingering long after they had gone. The moment Jonathan and his mother stood, it was as if the entire restaurant exhaled. Conversations that had been stilled for too long cautiously resumed in hushed tones. Forks scraped against fine china, and the tension that had strangled the air slowly began to dissipate. But for some, especially the young waiter who stood rigidly in place, the moment was far from over. The restaurant manager turned to him sharply, his face flushed with both embarrassment and fear. "Come with me. Now." His voice, no longer masked with feigned politeness, was a sharp command. The waiter hesitated for only a second before stumbling after him toward the back of the restaurant. The doors to the staff area swung shut behind them, sealing off whatever frantic reprimand was about to take place. But Jonathan? He no longer spared them a glance. His attention was on his mother, steady and unwavering, as he guided her toward the exit with an effortless kind of care, an arm lightly resting near her elbow, his stride slightly slowed to match hers. The whispers continued as they moved. Some patrons, the ones who had witnessed everything unfold, now avoided their gazes entirely. Others, those whose guilt suddenly weighed on them, offered weak, awkward smiles, as if hoping that a silent apology would be enough. And then, just before they reached the door, a voice broke through the quiet. "Excuse me, ma'am." Jonathan's mother turned first, followed by Jonathan himself, both of them meeting the gaze of a middle-aged white woman seated near the window. Her husband beside her looked distinctly uncomfortable, his fingers fidgeting with the linen napkin on his lap. But she pressed on. "I just wanted to say—" The woman hesitated, but then, seemingly deciding that silence would be worse, continued. "What happened to you was wrong, and I'm sorry that no one stood up sooner." Jonathan's mother studied her for a long moment. Then, she simply offered a gentle smile, nodding once. "Thank you for saying that." The woman's face flickered with something like relief, but Jonathan didn't linger. He had seen it all before. Guilt after the fact, sympathy that came only when it was safe to be given. But his mother had always been more gracious than him, and if she was willing to acknowledge the effort, then he wouldn't dismiss it. With that, they stepped outside. The afternoon sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in soft strokes of gold and orange. Jonathan reached into his pocket, pulling out his car keys as they made their way toward the sleek black sedan parked just outside the entrance. As he opened the passenger door for her, his mother paused, turning to look up at him. "You didn't have to do all that, you know." Jonathan exhaled a quiet laugh. "Of course I did." She tilted her head, studying him the way only a mother could. "And did it make you feel better?" He hesitated, just for a second, because the truth was, no, not really. Nothing he had said, no lesson he had taught that young waiter, no power he had flexed, would undo the years of moments just like this one. This wasn't the first time his mother had been dismissed, and deep down, he knew it wouldn't be the last. But he also knew something else, that every single time, no matter where, no matter when, he would be there. So he simply smiled, shutting her door carefully, before making his way around to the driver's side. "Come on, Mom," he murmured as he slid in beside her. "Let's go home." And with that, the car eased forward, pulling away from the restaurant, from the people still whispering inside, from the weight of another battle fought. And his mother, ever composed, ever patient, sat quietly beside him. Because the world would always be the world. But she had raised a son who would never let it be that way, without a fight. The car moved smoothly down the quiet streets, the weight of the evening slowly settling between them. Jonathan drove in comfortable silence, his fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel as his mother gazed out the window, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city outside blurred past, towering buildings, people walking home from work, the distant hum of life continuing as if nothing had happened. And perhaps, to the rest of the world, nothing had. But to Jonathan, moments like these always left a mark. Finally, his mother broke the silence. "You know," she said softly, still looking out at the world beyond the glass, "I didn't need you to step in like that." Jonathan exhaled a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah, Mom, I know." She turned to face him then, her wise eyes searching his. "So why do you always feel like you have to?" His grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. He could have given a dozen answers. Because it was the right thing to do. Because people like that waiter needed to be held accountable. Because he refused to let the world treat his mother like she was invisible. But none of those were the real reason. Instead, he glanced at her and said, "Because I saw you fight alone too many times when I was a kid, and I swore I'd never let that happen again." She sighed, a mix of sadness and pride flickering in her expression. "Oh, Jonathan," she murmured, shaking her head, "you can't fix the world, you know." "No," he agreed, "but I can damn sure make it think twice before it tries to mess with you." She let out a soft laugh, one of those knowing laughs only a mother could have. "You've always been stubborn like your father," she mused. "But I suppose that's not a bad thing." They drove in silence for a little while longer, the weight of the night settling, but not lingering. As they reached her house, Jonathan pulled into the driveway, shifting the car into park. Before she could reach for the door handle, he turned to her. "Mom," he said, his voice softer now, no longer the sharp, commanding tone he used in the restaurant. "Are you okay?" She smiled, patting his hand gently. "I've been okay for a long time, son." Jonathan held her gaze for a beat longer, before finally nodding. He knew she was telling the truth, but that didn't mean he'd ever stop making sure of it. She stepped out of the car, turning back to him one last time, before heading inside. "Next time," she teased, "let's just go somewhere that actually wants my business." Jonathan grinned. "Deal." As he watched her disappear into the house, he let out a slow breath, leaning back in his seat for a moment before starting the engine again. The fight was over, for now. But he knew there would always be another, and he would be ready. Because the world wasn't fair. But that didn't mean he had to accept it. And maybe, just maybe, if enough people stood up the way he did today, the world would start to change. One moment, one person, one choice at a time. Now, here's the real question. What would you have done in Jonathan's place? Would you have spoken up? Would you have let it slide? Or have you ever been in a moment like this yourself? Let's talk about it in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And hey, if this story resonated with you, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge the way we see the world. Because every voice matters, including yours.